Deanna Ashley gained her medical degree at the University of the West Indies Mona campus as a paediatrician and public health specialist, and she worked for over 35 years in the public sector, serving at Bustamante Hospital for Children and the Ministry of Health in Jamaica. Over the decades, she combined administration and management with research and conducted several major research projects. Internationally and locally, she has served on several boards, WHO, PAHO, and other technical expert and advisory committees. Dr. Ashley has received several local and international awards and received national honors. To receive these awards shows that she is well qualified to present today's topic. So without further ado, Deanna Ashley, over to you.
Good morning, everyone. And thank you very much for inviting me to do this presentation, a very topical subject and of great concern to all educators and to the society in general. And we know that we don't have the research evidence, but the anecdotal evidence is that returning to school after the long lockdown period, there has been an upsurge, certainly initially, an upsurge in violence at schools. This morning, I invited Colleen Wint-Bond, who works with us at the Violence Prevention Alliance and has done some of the work related to interventions related to violence in Jamaica, especially in children and youth. And she's here with us today. I am going to take off my video because I don't really trust our internet system. It's been fluctuating since morning. So I'm going to take off the video so it doesn't stress it. And then I would share the presentation with Colleen. So at points she will come in and speak to certain aspects of the work. Okay, thanks. Colleen, you want to start? Okay. All right, this presentation will give you some background and context of violence. And just to say that we are focusing on violence as it relates to the research that we have in Jamaica. So bear with me on that point. We will discuss why the focus on children and the factors contributing to school violence. Understanding the individual experiences, how it works in the brain and affects the brain, and looking at adverse childhood experiences, and looking at factors within the community and the society in general that influence school violence. And then looking at the prevention and looking at especially how to reduce the effects of violence on the growth and development of our children by starting in the early years. And we then give some examples of local programs. Okay. Go ahead, next. This presentation actually is focusing on violence within the school setting, but I'm sure you all will agree and have experienced that children, the violence related to school can happen and does happen outside of the school, but it may have originated or been influenced, but like something that happened in the school. And then, as I said, we'll use some evidence from research that has been done in Jamaica. Just to say that violence, this data from a study on the cost of care, and that was done in 2016 by Elizabeth Ward and Trevor McCartney and others, and by the Violence Prevention Alliance and University Hospital, and looked at data across major hospitals in the country. And you'll see, of course, Jamaica is ranked in the top 5 with the highest rates of violence in the world. The violence-related injuries seen and treated at our hospitals cost about 12% of the annual budget of the health services. The direct cost of care, this was estimated in 2016 at $3.6 billion. And the indirect costs, which incorporates the loss of earnings and disabilities generated by these injuries, was estimated at $5 billion. So it's a major, major cost factor on our country. Next. Now, well, why are we concerned about children? It violates the child's right to be protected from violence. It has physical and psychological impacts on the victims and the risk of future cycles, generating future cycles of violence. It's been shown to correlate with lower academic achievement, and it's certainly a major barrier to the achievement of the UN Sustainable Development Goals on education and gender. It has long-term, short-term and long-term consequences, and which affects learning. It encourages the use of violence to solve problems, increases antisocial behavior, and contributes to health in the long term as adults. And you'll see this especially, it's been shown that exposure to violence, chronic exposure to violence and trauma in the early years can lead to increased risk of the non-communicable diseases like hypertension, diabetes, etc. It has a significant financial cost, and school is a safe place, is a site that you can, in fact, for prevention and social norms. Okay. I was just wondering, I see something blocking the lower part of the slides. I don't know if everybody is okay.
Hi, Deanna.
Yes,
Sorry
yeah.
to interrupt. Could you stop sharing for a moment? Stop sharing.
Oh, okay. Colleen, can you just...
Yes, Colleen, reshare, but uncheck optimize video. Okay.
Okay.
We should be good
right.
to go there.
The box is gone now.
All
Okay,
right.
great. Okay, that is gone, right. So I think this slide is clear now. Okay, so there are factors that contribute to school violence. At the individual level, there's the gender differences as well. Experiencing abuse in childhood, the socioeconomic factors that put extra stress on the families and the individuals, academic achievement, learning difficulties, drugs. So they live at the individual level. Relationships are important contributors. e- exposure to violence and abuse within the home environment, the influence of peers, friends and families who are involved in crime or violent activities. And there's a community, the social norms, the level of crime and violence within the community. And then there's the societal aspects, cultural acceptance of violence and other negative social norms. As you know, but certainly there's a attitude which says, an eye for an eye, I've got to get even. You do me something, I'm going to get even with you. Issues around reprisal, which is prevalent certainly in the Jamaican culture. I'm not sure what it is in the rest of the Caribbean, but certainly this is a problem. But there's several things, I mean, that I'm sure that you all experience, that within the school setting, slightest thing can trigger an incident, a violent incident. I recall sitting at the door, close to the door in the principal's office at a school in Jamaica, break time, and children are out playing in the schoolyard, which was actually the driveway. And two boys kicking stone that was their football. And one accidentally kicked the other. And the next thing I knew was the one that had got kicked threw a stone, which actually just missed my head. It missed his intended victim, but instead came across my head. And when I asked, they started to fight. I managed to call them. And when I asked why, what happened, he said, well, he was kicked. They assured me they were friends. But the notion that he also indicated that he didn't think this was a deliberate kick. It was because they were playing. Yet still, he felt it was necessary to get even with the other youth. And so he decided he was going to stone him. And hence that triggered the beginning of what could have been a really violent fight. And in talking to them, they didn't see that there was anything wrong. They both agreed they were friends. The incident was unintentional, but this notion that I have to get even with you, the fight response, impulsive fight response, led him to use the stone. Eventually, they recognized they were wrong and apologized and shook hands and went back to play. But again, that impulsive behavior in a 10-year-old, a 9-year-old, a 10-year-old could have led to somebody getting seriously injured. So these are some of the things that end up with somebody injured or actually dead. So children experience violence across all ages and childhood, and occur in diverse settings. Violence and abuse against children is often committed by trusted individuals with whom they interact on a daily basis. And it's experienced differently by boys who are more likely to be victims of physical abuse. And actually those incidents tend to occur more outside of the home. And girls who are at higher risk of sexual abuse, which tends to occur more within the home setting. Next. You can check. Go ahead, right. All right, so this just sets out the various points that the child can be affected by violence as that child grows. In the early years, in those first early years under 3, they witness the violence within the home setting and discipline at home, neglect, and often they experience serious injury or death. In the middle years, again, violent discipline at home with corporal punishment at school, and there are various guidelines or laws that say that corporal punishment at school is prohibited, but still occurs. Verbal abuse becomes increased during this period of age. So if it's not corporal, physical abuse, it tends to be more verbal abuse. They witness violence within the home, domestic violence, and bullying peers at school. Sexual violence begins to appear, especially at this age, going in through early adolescence into late adolescence, where the physical fights at school, the witnessing of violence occurring within the community, and intimate partner violence, boyfriend, girlfriend, relationships type of violence begin to occur in the adolescent and early and late adolescence. Next. Can change for me? Right. So and then obviously there are some children that are more vulnerable, children with disabilities, indigenous children, orphans, wards of the state, children who are street children who have different appearances. They may be obese or have a physical abnormality that makes them look different. Children who drop out of school or who are suspended or expelled they're out of school and therefore at greater risk of violence. And then different children with different sexual identities or sexual orientation. And there's racial and ethnic or religious identity issues that makes a child different. So those are some of the contributing factors. And then but the important part that we need to understand is the brain and how the brain functions and responds to experiences of abuse and violence over the years. Remember that at birth, the brain is actually the largest organ and probably the most developed of the organs in the body at that point at delivery in a normal full-term baby. As the brain has several sections, right? It's a controlled panel of our personality and our ability to communicate. The frontal lobe of the brain, which is shown there in the picture, the frontal lobe, controls the cognitive skills, such as emotional expression, problem solving, memory, language, reasoning, judgment, and sexual behaviors. But the pathways to that frontal lobe's development occurs slowly over time, and it's not expected to reach its full maturity until around the age of 25. Girls mature earlier than boys, and it's so somewhere between 24 and 25, that frontal lobe, the maturation of the brain occurs fully. And in boys, it tends to be somewhere between 25, 26. So expectations of achieving maturity and doing what we would like them to do, it's not unusual to see some behaviors which we deem unacceptable, but that maturity is not there before that age. The early experiences in life affects this development. Trauma, abuse, and violence blocks the development of these pathways. Next. Okay, so the typical brain will develop, as you say, going through survival mode, learning to regulate, responding to the social environment, and getting full cognition. Whereas if you have trauma, and chronic trauma especially, the survival instincts of flight and fight and impulsive behaviors is a response and weakens, and so cognition is not being developed. It blocks the pathway of that development. Okay, next. So in the Jamaica data, we see that 8 out of 10 children experience some form of violence, form of violent discipline between the ages of 2 and 4. All forms of violence and abuse, including verbal and sexual or abuse, emotional and physical abuse. We tend to think of violence in the form of physical, but all of verbal is as impactful as physical, and have negative effects on the brain and its development. Exposure and witnessing violence is just as impactful as actually being actually physically abused and experiencing that violence, and as long lasting. So to witness the violence produces the negative effects on behavior, which lead to aggression and other forms of violence, illegal involvement in crimes, and impairment of learning and educational achievement. Okay, well, I hope you enjoyed that video. And just to let us know that there are ways to prevent it. The brain is a wonderful organ, and it can bounce back. And just to remember what resilience is, right? It's a process of handling stress and recovering from trauma or adversity. It's the ability to bounce back after challenges and tough times. And resilient children can recover from these setbacks and the trauma that they are exposed to. If they receive certain support, there are protective factors, supportive parenting or caregivers, adaptive skill building, stable environment, and receiving positive experiences. And there are the threads, the resilient factors, the factors that build resiliency, of thinking and to create the thinking and learning brain, to create hope and optimism and faith in their future, to facilitate regulation and self-control, to build self-efficacy and believing in one's and self-confidence, becoming secure through attachments and developing skills and mastery skills, and having social connections. So things that, but the trauma, especially chronic trauma, constant abuse and exposure to violence, doesn't allow the thinking and the learning, and so the brain shuts down pathways and it blocks those pathways. It prevents the development of hope and a sense of looking ahead for the future. There is the immediate, impulsive, responsive to deal with any threat. So the flight and fight response is dominant. It prevents the development of self-efficacy and self-confidence. So you're reacting to situations. It again prevents the development of attachments. Learning is shut down by the constant trauma that blocks these pathways. And again, the inability to develop social connections. So that gives you a summary of, a simple summary of the brain and the brain functions. So I think we can take a pause here and ask a few questions, and then Colleen will take over for the next part of the presentation. Thank you. So we'll take any quick questions here.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Ashley and Ms. Wint. That was really that first part was really very, very insightful. Even for someone like me who is in tertiary education, and I'm seeing how it's relevant for us to have teachers and persons who are preparing to work in schools be aware of this kind of information so that they would know what they are dealing with in schools. We have a number of questions, and I'll continue to ask you to put your questions in the question and answer, not in the chat, but in the Q&A that you will see at the bottom of your screen. So we will go first to a question by Elziva Coffey. Elziva asks, 8 out of 10 children experience some form of abuse, which is something you mentioned in your presentation. She says, it sounds very high. Is there any descriptors as to specifics that are included?
Sorry, the experiences of abuse and violence?
Yes. She says 8 out of 10 children experience some form of abuse.
Yeah.
And that sounds to her, she said that sounds very high. That is 8 out of 10. So she's asking, is there any descriptors, or are there any descriptors as to specifics that are included?
Right. That includes both physical and verbal abuse. I mean, there's beatings, and these are children under the age of 10. I didn't show you the details, but if you look up Professor Maureen Vaughn's studies on polyvictimization of children, you'll see it's from pinching, biting, beating, verbal abuse, sexual abuse, right? That are included in there. And there is, as she says, it's polyvictimization. It's not, children are experiencing more than one form of exposure or involvement in violence. So this is something which we've identified over, we followed children, a cohort study following children from birth through to age 15. The cohort started in 1986. So those are the forms. And actually, we've just been doing violence against children's survey, national survey. We don't have the findings as yet. We should have the findings by the end of the year, which will, this is direct interview of children in the 17 and over age group to ask them what their experiences were related to violence, and we'll see whether this validates our previous studies, right? And I say the data that we present here is Jamaica. I don't know what it is in the rest of the Caribbean. What you'll see also is the pinching and the biting and that sort of thing occurs in the younger age group. The physical violence, as they go older, the physical violence decreases and the verbal abuse increases, and the sexual abuse. So our violence-related injuries surveillance shows a similar pattern. So we hope the survey will also add some new data and give us some more current data, but our previous studies have shown this level of abuse. And I say it's a mix of physical, verbal, sexual abuse.
Okay, thank you very much for that response, Dr. Ashley. And Elziva, I think you got a comprehensive answer to your question there. We move now to Sebastian Narayansing's question, which is, does diet have any effect on an individual being violent? And I noted that somebody else in the chat had asked or mentioned something similar. So that person's comment or interest would be responded to through answering this question. Right.
Well, again, the data from the early the reach-up study was an early stimulation study that focused and worked with children who were malnourished. And whether it actually has a direct effect or how much effect, we still need to actually do some more work, especially in the school-age child. But we know that undernutrition and malnutrition affects the brain's development. So that anything I think that impacts the brain's development will also affect how it develops and how these pathways mature. We certainly know that it affects learning. Undernutrition, poor nutrition affects learning. So, and children affects children focus. A hungry child does not focus. And so all the interventions that we do with children in any after school program, we know that, and from our experience, unless they are fed, they do not participate and they do not focus and they do not learn. So there seems to be an association. What is the actual, we've not set up, for instance, control studies which randomized control shows which try to test this, but we think it's an important component of any intervention.